You are what you eat. That's a pretty easy to digest, non-controversial statement, and yet we are still surprised when Ryandaughtr eats the heart of a god and then fuses with that god. Okay, maybe we have every right to be surprised. After all, if I eat a burger, I don't become a cow. That'd just be silly. I mean, my body would be partially made of cow, but I would not fuse with cow. At least I hope not. Now, thankfully, we do see this real-world logic carried over into Genshin with instances like the consecrated beasts. They were animals who ate god flesh and got godly powers, but they did not become the gods. You can see a similar thing happen with Jacob when he ate parts of Elenus. He did not become Elenus, but he did get some of those powers. So this does beg the question then. Why did Ryandaughtr become Naberius after eating them? Or at least, why did she fuse with Naberius? Like, what's the difference between what she did and what the consecrated beasts do, or what I do at lunchtime? Well, based on what we learned from Albedo and Durin during the Paralogism quest, I think using the word heart to describe Ryandaugtr's meal is a little misleading. I think it's more accurate to say that she ate a soul rather than a heart. And that changes the entire narrative. So today, I want to talk about the soul. I want to know what a soul is, why Ryandaughtr ate one, and why it was important for Albedo to make a new custom soul for Durin. We're mostly talking about witches and magic today, which is why now is a great time to introduce you to the Red Magic 10 Air gaming phone, which just so happens to be the sponsor of today's video. One of the things I love about this company is how every model improves on the previous one in a very noticeable and meaningful way. For example, this is the Red Magic 10 Pro, and this is the Red Magic 10 Air. Now, not only does the Air model have a slimmer form factor to make it lighter, but its size actually improves the cooling efficiency of its liquid metal cooling tech. A cooler phone means better battery performance, and your phone will just last you longer because the heat won't damage the insides as much over time. The Red Magic 10 Air also has the largest battery in its class, and still boasts the powerful Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 3 processor. This means that you can easily play games like Genshin Impact, Zenless Zone Zero, Wuthering Waves, or even Honkai Star Rail at 60 FPS for hours at a time. And the Red Magic 10 Air does all this while being significantly cheaper than the Red Magic 10 Pro. Plus, you also get all the great features that Red Magic gaming phones are known for, like that beautifully sharp 1.5K resolution BOE AMOLED screen that's bright enough to play outside comfortably, as well as two 50-megapixel cameras, very impressive speakers for those times you don't want to wear your headphones, fully customizable shoulder triggers that let you feel like you're playing with a real controller, and it also has haptic vibration feedback. And it comes fully loaded with the Red Magic GameSpace app. For those of you who are in the market for a new phone, I'll leave a link to the Red Magic 10 Air in the description box, so you can check it out for yourself. And if you already have a Red Magic phone, then you can participate in the My Red Magic UI giveaway. All you have to do is take a screenshot or video of your smartphone's home screen, then share it on the social media platform of your choice using the hashtag MyRedMagicUI and RedMagic10Air. And don't forget to tag the Red Magic team at @RedMagic. You could win some fun prizes. A huge thanks to our friends over at Red Magic for sponsoring this video. And now it's time for a little soul searching as we piece together the truth of this world. Starting with why I think a heart is really a soul. So like I said earlier, despite being called a heart, what Ryandaughtr consumed wasn't really a fleshy organ of a god at all. It would be more accurate to think of it as a heart of God, a physical manifestation of a god's essence. Or to use a more familiar word, a physical manifestation of a god's soul. Now, many mythologies and religions around the world have tried to not just define the concept of a soul, but also determine where it lives within the body. Ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and Christians, and even some Islamic practices, for example, believed that the heart was home to the soul. This is called the cardiocentric hypothesis and is still widely believed today, and its prevalence, especially in the Greek philosophical circles, of which Hoyo is particularly fond of, makes it pretty likely that this is the view that Genshin is taking as well. So if we assume that in Genshin, the heart is the container for the soul, then the difference between Ryandaugtr's consumption of Naberius' heart and the consecrated beast's consumption of god meat starts to make a little bit more sense. The beasts ate flesh, so their flesh was altered, while Ryandaughtr ate a soul, so her soul was altered, and that changed who she was at her core, not just her physical appearance. Now, you can argue against this logic, but it is worth pointing out that when Albedo set out to make a new soul for Durin, one of the two primary ingredients was blood extracted from Durin's heart. This means that half of Durin's new human soul would be made from the original Durin's soul, and therefore Genshin does consider the heart to be a container for the soul. Or at least I think it's a fairly safe assumption at this point. But you're probably wondering, what is a soul exactly? Because sure, I can get behind the whole heart as a container for the soul thing, but the other half of Durin's new human soul was made from Mini Durin, and Mini Durin is just a storybook character brought to life. Is that somehow a soul too? Well, yes, it is. Let me explain. So Albedo's true goal in creating life, or rather attempting human transmutation, was to complete the task his mother Rhine-daughter assigned to him before she left, which was find the truth of this world. Now, Albedo reasoned that she actually wanted him to get a life, or to put it more clearly, she wanted him to experience what it meant to live. This meant learning about the world himself and the people around him, because life itself is just the space between you and the world you live in. Now, Mini-Durin is a manifestation of a storybook character, so his world would be the Book of Simulanka, which means that the space between the character of Mini-Durin and the world of Simulanka is his story. So Rhine-daughter's lesson to Albedo was simply that life is just a story. Now take another look at the ingredients for Durin's new human soul. We've got life force extracted from Big Durin's heart and the story of Mini-Durin. If life is a story, then Albedo is just merging two stories about Durin together to make a new story. And that new story is the brand new human soul of Durin. Ergo, stories are the essence of the soul. So the reason why Albedo wanted to make a brand new soul through the fusion of two stories was because he wanted to change Durin's fate. Because if he didn't, then Durin was fated to destroy Mondstadt, and that would be very bad. Now, you might be wondering, why would this even work? Why would fusing two stories together change the fate of Durin? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back to Simulanka, because that's where Mini-Durin is from. Simulanka is a storybook written by one of the Hexenzirkel witches, Anya Andersdaughters, also known as M. With the help of the other witches, the storybook world of Simulanka was brought to life and became something like a mirror or a parallel counterpart to Teyvat. This means that what happens in Teyvat influenced what happened in Simulanka, and vice versa. For example, any character within Simulanka who shared a name with someone from Teyvat would end up sharing the same fate as their Teyvat counterpart. This is because, as far as stories are concerned, being given a name is the same as being assigned a role within the story itself. Once you're assigned a role, you have to play that part. So when M created a little dragon character and named it Durin, that little dragon took on the same role as Big Durin. So this Mini-Durin had the same situation and traits as Big Durin. He was created by a witch, possessed the same childish innocence and kindness, as well as a very destructive body that he couldn't control, which made him incredibly lonely because he couldn't make any friends. But this is where the fates of Big Durin and Mini-Durin diverge. While Big Durin was left to fester, isolated on an icy mountainside after Dvalin ripped out his throat, Mini-Durin encountered some travelers from Teyvat who befriended him and blessed him with a new, less harmful body, which allowed him to obtain that elusive happy ending that his mother, M, wanted for him. Now, among those new friends of Mini-Durin was Wanderer, whom Mini-Durin grew weirdly attached to despite Wanderer's severe lack of friendliness. I mean, technically they both became quite fond of each other, and Mini-Durin ended up leaving Simulanka to stay with Wanderer and Sumeru, but that's kind of not the point here. But you'd think that Mini-Durin's attachment to Wanderer is why Albedo asks Wanderer for help in dealing with Big Durin's inevitable resurrection. But that's not quite right. He didn't want Wanderer's help with Big Durin's resurrection, exactly, because it's not like Albedo needed anyone's help performing human transmutation. That whole process went pretty easily for him on the whole. But Albedo isn't really equipped to help human Durin navigate this new existence that we call life. He's not the best person to teach human Durin how to live as a character within the story of this world, and he's especially ill-suited to dealing with Durin's inevitable emotional crises that he's going to be going through as he tries to reconcile this innocent, storybook idealized part of him in Mini-Durin and the super destructive and vengeful side of him in Big Durin. But Durin is still gonna need a guide lest he go down the wrong path again. And that guide should be Wanderer. That's why Albedo asked Wanderer for his help back in Simulanka. Now you're probably wondering why it has to be Wanderer of all people and what exactly all of this has to do with souls, given that's what this whole investigation is about. And to put it simply, the guide has to be Wanderer because Wanderer and Durin have the exact same backstory. They have been through the exact same things. Think about it for a second. Both Wanderer and Durin were abandoned by their mothers. They both started out full of childlike innocence and kindness. Then they were both rejected by the people they wanted to befriend. And in the end, they both wished they had never been born at all. Wanderer recognized this early on in Simulanka, which is why he was weirdly empathetic towards Durin, while everyone else was fairly hostile. Because of their shared experiences, because of their similar backstories, Wanderer is probably the only person capable of truly empathizing with Durin. Durin. And that also means he is the best person to teach this newly resurrected Durin what it means to be human. He's had nearly the same experiences, including being reforged and reborn from two versions of himself. And if anyone knows what it means to want to repent for things that you've done, it would be him. Now, I don't think that Albedo knows exactly what Wanderer's deal is, but I do think that he had a theory about why Durin was so attached to Wanderer and made a few reasonable assumptions, and that's why he picked him to help. Or maybe Alice knew what was up with Wanderer, and somehow Albedo figured it out because Wanderer was assigned the role of a hero in the story. Who knows? It doesn't really matter, honestly. But among all of Wanderer and Durin's commonalities, there's one very important one that I didn't mention yet. And that is the fact that both Wanderer and Durin had a desire to obtain the heart of their respective mothers. Wanderer's desire for a heart is very, very obvious, as much of his motivations centered around wanting a heart of his own, and he truly believed that the heart that belonged to him was A's electro-gnosis, which is funny because in Chinese, the gnosis is called the heart of God. Now, I do have to clarify that the electro-gnosis is not A's heart, it's just the heart of a god that is in A's possession, or at least it was. Either way, it was a heart that was in the care of his mother, and it was the one that he thought belonged to him. So he wanted it. It's pretty straightforward. Mini Durin's situation, on the other hand, is a little less straightforward because Mini Durin has no evidence of wanting a heart at all. But he did want a star. But more specifically, he wanted the star that his mother said that she would become after she died, and that's why he knocked so many stars out of the sky around Constellation Metropole. He was looking for his mother's star. Now, technically speaking, stars and hearts are not the same thing, but this did catch my attention because a while back, we learned that the Gnosis are actually the remains of the third Descender, and I've hypothesized in the past that all Descenders are likely the same type of entity. So if the Traveler is the fourth Descender and also considers themselves a star, then the third Descender should also be a star or a star-like entity, right? That makes the Gnosis the remains of a star. Now, whether or not you agree with this logic is kind of irrelevant right now because the parallels that already exist between Durin and Wanderer's stories suggest that the Gnosis and the star are the same type of thing. They hold the same type of meaning to both Wanderer and Durin. In other words, they are both those heart cores that I was talking about, you know, the same type that Rhine-daughter ate. The ones that contain the soul of a person. So basically what we've learned here is that a star has the same purpose as a heart in that both should serve as vessels for the soul of a person, and that a story can be used to forge a soul. Now, what do you think happens when we put these ideas together? Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but Big Durin's heart was more of a rock than it was an organ, and that does seem to be a trait that's shared with other dragons, specifically Vishops. According to the juvenile Jade, Vishops cultivate these special crystals within their bodies that eventually replace their real heart completely, and only then do they become a true dragon. This idea of dragons having crystallized hearts full of magic power comes from Asiatic dragons. Unlike Western dragons, Asiatic dragons, specifically Chinese and Japanese dragons, possess a flaming pearl that contains all of their knowledge and power. Now, these pearls were so precious to their respective dragons that if the dragon were to lose their pearl, they would also lose their power. And should someone find the pearl and eat it, that person would receive all of the dragon's knowledge and power before literally becoming the dragon itself. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It sounds a bit like what happened with Rhine-daughter. But this whole absorbing power and wisdom by eating a heart core pearl thing isn't limited to just dragons. There's a whole high fantasy genre of Chinese media known as xianxia that focuses on people who train themselves to learn mystical arts. And in doing so, they create these power cores. And likewise, they can ingest cores from others to obtain new powers and knowledge. And it just so happens that Genshin pulls quite heavily from this genre. I'm not gonna go too deep into that right now because I did make a whole video about this a while back, and you can just check that out if you want to learn more about how all of this applies to Genshin specifically. But for the purposes of this video, I want to assume that someone's heart core is just a rock in the same way that Big Durin's heart is just a rock. And if a heart core is just a rock, then that makes Wanderer's teaser video really funny because the fairy tale the little kid tells him is about a tin man who is set on fire, leaving nothing behind except for a crystal heart. And if we think about that correlation between the Gnosis heart and the star heart from earlier, we can double down on this idea, because every Gnosis has a gem-like core in it, and in Teyvat,
the stars, the sky, it's all a gigantic hoax, a lie.
Yes, thank you, Wanderer. You're right. Nearly 5 years later, the Unreconciled Stars event still remains as relevant as ever because that was the event where we learned that the stars in Teyvat are, in fact, rocks. But not just any rocks. These rocks are filled with memories, and if someone comes in contact with one of these rock stars, they will be directly influenced by the memories that are trapped inside. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that this is exactly what happened with Big Durin's heart as well. The heart, much like Leonard's star, contained Durin's memories, emotions, and his will. So when people got too close to it, they fell under the influence of Durin's memories, the same way that the people in Unreconciled Stars fell under the influence of Leonard's memories when they got too close to his meteorites. So this suggests that heart cores and stars are basically the same thing. They're rocks that contain the memories of their owners. And others can tap into these memories via proximity or consumption. So when M told Minnie Durin that she would become a star when she died, she was basically saying that her memories would be left behind in a crystalline structure, a star-shaped heart rock core thing. And honestly, this is probably hinting at what happens to people when they die in Teyvat in general. And maybe that's also what Wanderer's teaser was about, because the only thing left after death was a crystal heart, a star, a rock, a memory core. But I wonder, is it really memories that are contained within these heart core star things? Because if it is, then that would make heart cores no different from Sumeru's knowledge capsules. But that doesn't feel right. I feel like there should be a big difference between a heart core and a knowledge capsule. And I think the key to understanding that difference is found in Capitano. See, Capitano, or rather Thrain, had a bit of a unique heart. It was artificial, a marvel of Conrian technology, and it was meant to store knowledge, just like a knowledge capsule. The idea is that Thrain would be able to draw upon the knowledge within his heart whenever he needed it. But then came the cataclysm. Thrain found himself on a battlefield full of the Fallen, and with the Night Kingdom so heavily damaged, the souls of these fallen Conrian and Natlan warriors had nowhere to go. So Thrain repurposed his heart as a container for all of those wandering souls. But I think this phrasing is a bit misleading because Thrain didn't actually extract some incorporeal spirit or ghostly apparition from the hearts of the fallen. He simply extracted the warriors' stories. When he extracted Guthred's story, for example, the way Guthred appeared and acted matched the way that Guthred remembered himself. It was how he remembered his own story. But a second Guthred appeared later on in the Night Kingdom, and this one was not the same one as the one that Thrain had in his heart. This one was a manifestation of the stories that the people of Natlan told about Guthred, and that is why his behavior is so different from his previous appearance. Both of these manifestations are the same character, but they are based on the memories of different storytellers. One is a true unedited version, while the other is a tale of an idealized hero. If we apply this same logic to the Durins, then Big Durin's heart contains his true story, while Mini Durin is the idealized version, and Albedo needed to extract both stories to create a new story for human Durin. But to put this another way, a soul is nothing more than a story. Your history, if you will. This story represents your life, and as we established earlier, your life story is your relationship with the world around you. So if you were to consume someone else's soul or their story, then their soul or story would merge with your own. Those two stories would become one new story. And that also means that the difference between a knowledge capsule and a heart core is that a knowledge capsule only contains a few selected memories, while a heart core contains an entire all-encompassing story. That said, I do think there's something about the knowledge capsules that still relates to the heart cores. Like, have you noticed how much capsules look like berries or maybe fruits? Well, Irminsul produces crystalline fruit. I made a video about this years ago, and the TLDR is that those crystalline fruit are likely the rock stars in the sky, which makes sense when you remember the fact that Irminsul's leyline root system carries all of the memories of the world throughout them. Irminsul is actually actively recording the stories of people and hanging them in the sky as stars that then form constellation. This in turn makes up the system of fate, because when you are assigned a constellation, you are assigned a fate, a role within the greater story of the world. And this is mirrored in the way that the ancient names work, right? They also represent a role that the bearer plays within a greater story of Natlan, and they are forged through the study of a first hero's story, which then evolves over time as more people take on the ancient names role and expand that story. But here's the thing. If heart cores are stars and stars are the crystalline fruits of Irminsul, well, fruits have one goal: to be eaten so their seeds can be spread. But seeds can be intentionally planted too, right? And the person who plants and cultivates seeds would be called a gardener. And hey, didn't Albedo say something about becoming a gardener? And how his family tends the flower beds? Albedo did, in fact, talk about being a gardener during the Paralogism quest, yes, but the first time he actually used this analogy was during the Shadows Amidst Snowstorm limited event, although the metaphor is more or less being used in the same way in both quests. He's using it as a way to talk about creating life through alchemy. He even talks about how planting fruits may result in fruit trees, which is funny in the context of Irminsul fruit. I don't really think this metaphor needs much explaining, because a gardener is simply the one in charge of planting the seeds of stories, and if Rhine-Daughter is considered a gardener, then so too should the Shade of Life Naberius be a gardener, especially now that they're fused together. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever Genshin uses a very straightforward metaphor, I always get a bit suspicious because I just don't trust this company to make anything simple. So I've been thinking about this gardener analogy for a very long time, because its simplicity bothered me way more than it should, but it wasn't until Albedo activated his human transmutation array that I figured out the so-called hidden meaning of the gardener metaphor. Let me draw your attention to this one line within his incantation that stuck with me. Traverse the 18th, worldly, and 20th passage. This line means absolutely nothing at first glance. Who knows what this is referring to? It could honestly be anything. There's a plethora of esoterica to pick through. But I think I figured out what they're talking about here. I could be totally wrong about it, but if I am wrong about it, then this is just a bizarrely cool coincidence, and I think it's worth sharing regardless. Okay, so the word passage can be a pathway or a corridor, and that is how I initially interpreted it, but a passage can also be a section from a book. If that's the case, then 18th, worldly, and 20th passages could be passages 18 through 20. But which book would they be from? Well, I decided to look at the Bible first, the New Testament, actually, and I found something very cool in John 18 through 20. See, John 18 describes Jesus being arrested and then put on trial, which is exactly how paralogism started. Then John 19 describes Jesus' sentence, which was death by crucifixion, and John 20 describes Jesus' resurrection in a brand new form. Now, I am not saying that Albedo is Jesus here, but I will argue that Durin's journey is meant to reference Jesus' story here. Because if you think about it, during the trial, Albedo may have been the one in court, but it was Durin's crimes that he was being accused of. And it was Durin who was found guilty and sentenced to death by Albedo's hand. And in the end, it was Durin who was resurrected in a brand new form. Pretty weird coincidence if that's not what they're referencing, isn't it? And just a fun little detail, the place of crucifixion was called the Garden of Golgotha, a word that means skull. So Garden of the Skull. And you know something funny about Dragonspine? It has a giant skull, and before it got celestial nailed, it was a lush green paradise, kind of like a garden. And in John 20, Mary Magdalene is the one who checked Jesus' tomb only to find it empty. But when she turned around, she saw a man who she mistook for the gardener of Golgotha. But it wasn't the gardener of Golgotha, it was Jesus. So in this case, Albedo is the gardener of Golgotha and Jesus would be Durin. Allegorically, obviously. And that would also mean that Durin's Heartcore Chamber Cave is technically his tomb that was left empty after Albedo took the heart out of it, just like Jesus' tomb. And I find this Christian reference especially funny because Christianity has this practice of consuming the blood and flesh of Christ, of Jesus. This practice is called the Eucharist, and it was said to be a ritual that Jesus instructed his followers to partake in the night before his crucifixion happened. This was the Last Supper. His followers were supposed to consume bread as if it were his flesh and wine as if it were his blood, and to do so in memory of Jesus and his teachings. This is not the first time I've talked about the Eucharist on this channel. In fact, I've made a whole video about how this ritual may have influenced several god-eating practices in Genshin, like with the consecrated beasts or when Jacob ate the flesh of Elenus. And I also talked a lot about the necrophagic behavior of fungi and how that might relate to Shamaran's role in digesting decaying matter within the chasm. But since I've made that video, we've found Shamaran's origin story. Shamaran was a clone of the demon Bifrons. Now, Bifrons was a mushroom who could make clones of themselves and could also grant power to those who ate those clones. And in return for that power, Bifrons would obtain the ability to control the minds of the people who ate their clones, allowing them to form a sort of hive mind. Now, I am certain that when most people hear mind-controlling fungi, they think of cordyceps, specifically Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, also known as the zombie ant fungus, because after it infects an ant, it kills it and then pilots its body. Well, kind of. It's about as close to fungal mind control as you can get in the real world anyway. Now, most of you probably recognize this fungus as the cause of zombification in The Last of Us, but the cordyceps nature of Bifrons actually reminded me of the Lovecraftian Men of Lang, which I'm pretty sure most of you haven't heard of. In the short story titled Lang, two mycologists traveled to the Lang Plateau intending on studying the local fungi, but instead of doing that, they ended up joining the order of monks that lived there. Only problem is, all of those monks had been infected by a sentient strain of the mind-controlling cordyceps fungus. So these mycologists got infected and became monks themselves, and obviously then part of the hive mind. Now, these men of Lithin, men of Lang, are actually part of a necrophagic cult, meaning they eat the flesh of the deceased, similar to vultures or other scavengers, or more aptly put, fungi. This is why they are often represented by a deity that is shaped like a canine with the wings of a carrion bird like a crow, as we see in The Hound. And this description amuses me because it's very similar to the demon Naberius that Rhine-daughter ate. After all, Naberius was depicted either as a canine or a crow, so why not blend them both here? Plus, life exists as a result of consuming the dead, so necrophagy makes sense as a theme here too in terms of Naberius. And while you might suspect that Lovecraft gave these necrophagic tendencies to the monks for shock value, since he was writing horror stories and also had some very prejudiced views on things that were foreign to him, you're not entirely wrong, but you're not entirely right either. This does actually have some basis in reality. However, the source for this inspiration is far less creepy and far more spiritual, and it also ties back to Genshin. So the men of Lang live on the plateau of Lang, which, by all available descriptions, appears to be based on Tibet, hence the monks. And as far as I can tell, Lovecraft was referencing a practice of communion that was found within some Tibetan occultist sects. And he certainly went the extra mile to sensationalize this practice, because there really wasn't any necrophagy going on. Like I said, it was more of a spiritual thing. Essentially, some schools of Buddhism, like the Nyingma, believe that some people who are able to achieve spiritual perfection through personal cultivation have their bodies transformed in such a way that they take on special properties and stop being flesh as we typically understand it. So, if one were to theoretically consume this special transmuted flesh of the enlightened, then they could obtain supernatural powers and knowledge. But this does not suggest that any real flesh was consumed, okay? As far as I can tell, it's more of a metaphorical practice. To consume a part of one's enlightened master is to take another step towards enlightenment yourself, and that part that gets consumed can simply be the enlightened one's teachings. In fact, it may even refer to simply possessing a relic of an enlightened one. Sariras, for example, are both sutras, which are teachings, and relics that belong to the Buddha or holy individuals. And that matters because the word sarira literally means body. So consuming or possessing a sarira is like consuming or possessing the body of an enlightened individual. Really easy to see how Lovecraft can twist this around now, right? Incidentally, the term sarira is most often used to refer to little pearl or crystalline beads that are extracted from the cremated remains of an enlightened person. They're often kept in reliquaries, which frankly are quite reminiscent of the Gnosis in design. It's pretty fitting then, since both would contain the remains of a transcendent entity, right? Gnosis contains the remains of the third descender, and reliquaries would contain the sariras of a holy person. And that brings us right back to that core idea that hearts are more like cores that contain the essence of an individual. And as far as Genshin goes, this essence of an individual is their story, right? In the same way a sarira is both the body and the sutra of a Buddha or a holy person, so too is a heart core both a physical manifestation of a person and their story. Which makes me wonder if these necrophagic and Eucharistic references in Genshin aren't really about eating gods to obtain power and wisdom at all, but are instead a metaphor for reading. See, if someone's heart core is a physical object that contains their story, then a heart core is essentially a book. So to consume a heart core is to consume a book. And I really like this idea because once a story has been read, it stays with you for a long time after you finish it. In many ways, every book that you read shapes you. So you could say that by consuming a book or a story, that book or story becomes a part of you. You kinda fuse with it to some degree. And the Hexen Circle really understood the power of stories, and that's why, as an author of fairy tales, M was held in such high regard. She conceptualized the memory juice within the ley lines as ink with which she could pen a good story. Those stories would define the fate of her characters. And in the cases where she wrote about real people from her world, they provided a means through which one could change fate. Think of it this way. If Big Durin was able to read the story of Mini Durin, then that idealistic story of hope and friendship could become a part of Big Durin. That could change his perspective on the world and thus change his perspective on life and thus change his fate, which is more or less what I think is happening. But the power of stories isn't just about changing fates. Stories have the ability to become something more than just words on a page. They can transcend time and even break free of their author's control. I mean, just look at Lovecraft's works. He has an entire mythology that's completely transcended the boundaries of his short stories and entered the greater zeitgeist, where they've become entities in their own right, completely separate from him. Cthulhu is an excellent example of this phenomenon. And if you stop to think about it, the witches are also a pretty good example of this phenomenon. Alice, Barbeleth, and Rhine-Daughter are all characters from a novel, a myth, and a folktale. Nicole and Ivanovna are also most likely characters from a folktale, although we haven't quite pinned down which ones they are yet. But if they are, then Anya Andersdotter, also known as M, is the only person in the Hexen Circle who was based on a real person. An author, no less, since she was based on Hans Christian Andersen. And she was also a human with a limited lifespan, whereas the other witches who were based on fictional entities were all long-lived, like storybook characters whose existence exceeded that of their creators, allowing them to take on a life of their own. Just think about how many variations of Alice in Wonderland there are out there. Alice has long outgrown her original tale. And Alice's daughter, Clee, is also likely a character from a fairy tale. She's most likely Little Red Riding Hood. And Alice has said she's another long-lived species. I don't mean to get all meta about this, but when you really sit down and think about it, humans are simply creatures of story. We thrive on sharing stories with each other. We love writing and consuming stories. We pass on and teach important knowledge using stories, and when we die, we leave behind stories about ourselves. Stories are our essence. They're the way that we connect to the world around us. It's the way we understand the world around us. So one might even call them the soul of humanity itself. And since consuming stories is part of the human experience, I guess you could say that we're all made of stories. 'Cause we are what we eat. Well, welcome to the end of the video. Boy, when I sat down to do this, I actually went through the entirety of Simulanka. It was such a fun trip down memory lane, but at the same time, I'm so sad that it's a limited place. I think out of all of the limited events that we've had, that is one of the ones that I wish they would have made permanent content, and this would have been the perfect opportunity to just bring it back and make it that. Fingers crossed they actually do that. But my personal feelings aside, I think I've at least managed to convey my thoughts about Simulanka's core theme in this video, so I think that's a pretty good start. But I have by no means managed to cover every instance of stories, seeds, and souls and hearts being related here. I know I've missed a bunch, like how a fragment of Makoto's soul became a seed that A planted, or how the moon dials in Mondstadt talk about how the seeds of stories are carried by the wind and cultivated by time, or how knowledge capsules in Juvenile Jade look weirdly similar, both kind of fruit-like, or how the top of Constellation Metropole, which is connected to the stars which control fate, is actually called the Astral Garden, or even, as my editor pointed out very briefly earlier, how the story of the Tin Man and the Heart in Wanderer's Teaser was actually written by Hans Christian Andersen, which is who Anders' daughter is based off of. And that's barely scratching the surface of what's there. I'm sure you guys will be able to find even more places where all these things intersect. But hey, that's a great excuse to make good use of the comment section and share what you found with the rest of the class. But I think I've rambled on long enough. If you've made it this far, well, congratulations, you win I don't know. My gratitude. Thank you. Thank you for watching. And if you were one of the lovely channel members who put your name on the screen, or if you were one of the lovely channel members who didn't get your name on the screen, thank you very much for enabling my nonsense. I appreciate every single one of you. So do take care of yourselves out there. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the next video after all. As for me, I'm hungry, so I'm gonna go eat something or read something. Apparently they're the same thing. So I'll see you around. Bye.